need to tell you about my last night working in the subway system. I've kept this story to myself for 3 years, but after seeing the missing persons report on the news last week, I can't stay silent anymore. Someone needs to know what's happening beneath our city. The weight of this secret has been crushing me, keeping me awake at night as I lie next to my wife Maria, listening to the distant rumble of trains that might or might not be real. I worked the night shift maintenance for nearly a decade. It was a good job, paid well enough to support my family, and I didn't mind the solitude. Most people can't handle working in those tunnels at night. The darkness gets to them, or maybe it's the way sound echoes off those tiled walls, making you think you're hearing things that aren't there. The way footsteps follow you down empty corridors, only to disappear when you turn around. The way shadows seem to move in your peripheral vision, dancing just beyond the reach of your flashlight beam. But I was comfortable down there. At least I was until that final night. Let me give you some context. In the subway system, there's something we call the dead hour, that period between 2 a.m. and 3 a.m., when the last train has left, and the maintenance crews haven't started arriving yet. During the dead hour, it's just us night inspectors, walking those empty platforms, checking the tracks, making sure everything's ready for the morning rush. The city above might never sleep, but down here, in these concrete arteries beneath the streets, there's a stillness that feels almost sacred, or maybe sacrilegious, depending on what you believe lurks in the darkness. I knew every inch of those tunnels, could tell you where every dripping pipe was, which tiles were cracked, which emergency lights flickered. I knew the rhythm of the place, which echoes meant trouble, and which were just the subway breathing, settling into itself like an old house at night. The regulars down there knew me too. Homeless folks seeking shelter, cleanup crews, even old Tom who claimed he'd been riding the trains since 1904. We had our own little underground community, a society that existed in the spaces between day and night. That night started like any other. I was doing my final rounds at Chambers Street Station, one of the oldest in the system. The station still had some of its original tile work, elaborate mosaics that told stories of a city that no longer existed. It was 2:17 a.m. I remember checking my watch because I was thinking about grabbing coffee before heading home to Maria and our kids. The station was empty except for Sarah, the cleaning lady who always hummed hymns while she mopped. Her voice echoed softly through the station, making the place feel less lonely. I'd never asked what brought her to work these hours, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she understood the night in ways others didn't. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows that made the empty platform feel like a stage set for some forgotten play. The air was thick with the usual subway smell, a mixture of brake dust, ozone, and something older, something that reminded me of sealed tombs and forgotten places. I was checking a loose handrail, the third one from the stairs, always working itself loose no matter how many times we tightened it, when I heard it. The unmistakable rumble of an approaching train. At first, I thought I was hearing things. There shouldn't have been any trains running. The last one had left over an hour ago. I pulled out my radio to check if there was an unscheduled maintenance run, but all I got was static. Not the normal kind of static either. This sound was deeper, almost organic, like the growl of some massive beast echoing through the tunnels. Sarah had stopped humming. When I looked over, she was standing completely still, her mop forgotten at her feet. Her face had gone pale, and her hands were trembling. "Carlos!" she called out, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong. The air... it feels wrong." She clutched her cross necklace, her knuckles white against the silver. She was right. The temperature had dropped suddenly, and the air felt heavy, like just before a thunderstorm. But we were underground. The weather didn't work the same way down here. The rumbling grew louder, but it sounded different. Deeper somehow, as if it was coming from somewhere far below the regular tracks. from tunnels that weren't on any of our maps. The fluorescent lights started flickering, casting strange shadows across the platform. In those strobing moments, I could have sworn I saw figures standing on the platform, people from different eras, their clothes and faces flickering in and out of existence like bad television reception. Then the train appeared. It emerged from the tunnel like a ghost, its metal skin dark and pitted with age. No headlights, no interior lights, just a mass of darkness sliding into the station. The windows were clouded over, making it impossible to see inside. But sometimes, when the lights flickered, I thought I could see faces pressed against the glass. Hundreds of faces, all with the same expression of silent horror. The train's wheels made no sound as they rolled across the tracks, but the air was filled with a low, hollow moan that seemed to go on forever. A sound that made my bones ache and my teeth vibrate in their sockets. The train came to a stop, perfectly aligned with the platform, despite having no driver I could see. The cars were unlike any in our system. Older, much older, with details that belonged to different eras all mixed together. Victorian brass fixtures next to Art Deco panels, next to modern LED displays that showed impossible destinations in glitching, corrupted text. "That's not one of ours," I said into my radio, trying to keep my voice steady. "Dispatch, do you copy? We've got an unauthorized train at Chambers Street." Nothing but static answered me, but in that static, I could almost hear voices. Thousands of them, all talking at once, all begging for help. Sarah had backed away from the platform edge, clutching her cross necklace so tight I could see blood welling up around her fingernails. "Carlos, we should go. Please. Let's just go." Her voice had changed. There was a knowledge in it, an ancient understanding that made me wonder if she'd seen this train before. But I couldn't leave. It was my job to investigate irregularities, and this was definitely irregular. The doors slid open with a hiss that sounded almost like a sigh, or maybe a hungry intake of breath. No passengers got out, no crew members emerged, just darkness and that stale metallic smell, like old pennies in decay, like blood left to rust on iron rails. "Stay here," I told Sarah, pulling out my flashlight. The beam seemed weak, as if the darkness around the train was somehow solid, eating the light. "If I'm not back in 5 minutes, call it in." "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't go in there. They've been waiting for someone like you." But before I could ask what she meant, what she knew, I was already moving toward the open door. Something was pulling me forward. Curiosity, duty, or maybe something darker. Something that had been waiting in these tunnels since the first subway car rolled through them. The moment I stepped inside, the doors closed behind me. Not the normal mechanical sliding. They slammed shut with enough force to make the whole car shake, like a tomb being sealed. I spun around, watching through the clouded glass as Sarah ran to the emergency phone on the platform. But her figure was growing dimmer, fading away as if being erased from reality itself. The platform behind her was changing too, the modern tiles giving way to older stones, symbols carved into them that hurt my eyes to look at. The train started moving. I stumbled, grabbing onto a pole for support. The metal was ice cold under my fingers, and I could feel vibrations running through it that had nothing to do with the train's movement. The interior lights flickered on, casting a sickly yellow glow over the empty seats. That's when I noticed the personal belongings scattered everywhere. Purses, briefcases, phones, even toys. A teddy bear with one eye missing sat on a seat near me, staring accusingly into nothing. Its remaining eye seemed to follow me as I moved, and I could have sworn I saw it blink. Everything was covered in a layer of dust, as if these items had been sitting here for years. But they came from different times, all of them lost, all of them forgotten. I picked up a phone. The screen was cracked, but I could make out the date, September 15th, 1998. Next to it was a newspaper from 1976, the headlines warning about a serial killer who'd never been caught. A Walkman that looked brand new, but was clearly from the 80s, the headphones still playing a ghostly echo of some forgotten song. The train picked up speed, the wheels screaming against the rails. We weren't following any track I knew, and I knew them all. The tunnel outside the windows was different too, older, made of rough-hewn stone instead of concrete. Ancient-looking symbols were carved into the walls, flashing past too quickly to read, but their shapes left after-images in my mind that formed themselves into words I didn't want to understand. That's when I heard the voices. They started as whispers, barely audible over the sound of the train, but they grew louder, more distinct. Conversations overlapping each other, spanning decades, all of them cut short in the middle of a thought. Running late for my meeting. Just one more stop. Mommy, I want to go home. This isn't my usual train. Why won't anyone help us? Each voice carried its own tragedy, its own story of a journey that should have been routine but ended in this nightmare. I moved through the cars, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. Each car was the same, abandoned belongings, empty seats, voices growing louder. The air got colder with each door I opened, and the voices grew more desperate, more hungry. Until I reached the last car. They were waiting for me there. The car was full of people, or what had once been people. They sat in the seats, their forms translucent, flickering like bad television reception. A businessman in a 1950s suit, his face frozen in perpetual horror. A punk rocker with a spiked jacket, endlessly reliving his final moments. A little girl in a modern school uniform, crying silently as she clutched the one-eyed teddy bear I'd seen earlier. I recognized some of them from missing persons posters I'd seen over the years. The woman who'd vanished on her way to work last summer, still clutching her briefcase. The college student who'd disappeared 3 years ago, his headphones still playing music only he could hear. The little girl whose face had been on the news for weeks, whose parents still put up posters every year on her birthday. They turned to look at me, their hollow eyes filled with a hunger that transcended death. Their mouths opened in silent screams that somehow echoed in my mind, filling my head with their collective anguish. Years of loneliness, of riding these endless dark tunnels, of watching new passengers join their ranks, while they remained trapped between stations, between moments, between life and whatever comes after. One of them stood up, a middle-aged man in a maintenance uniform like mine. His name tag read Frank. I remembered the story. Frank Martinez disappeared during his shift in 1987. They never found him. But sometimes other workers claimed they heard his tools clanking in empty tunnels, or saw his flashlight beam in places where no one should be. "Welcome to the last train," he said, his voice sounding like gravel being crushed. "We've been waiting for a new conductor." His smile was too wide, showing too many teeth, all of them filed down to points. "Someone needs to drive this train, Carlos. Someone needs to keep collecting passengers. Why not you?" I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The train plunged deeper into the darkness, the wheels singing their hellish song. The ghosts rose from their seats, reaching for me with hands that passed through solid objects like smoke, but left freezing burns wherever they touched my skin. "Help us," they pleaded. "Set us free." But their eyes said something different. They didn't want freedom. They wanted company. They wanted me to join them, to become part of this eternal journey through tunnels that existed somewhere between reality and nightmare. I could feel myself growing weaker, my memories beginning to fade like old photographs. Images of Maria and our kids started slipping away, replaced by the endless rhythm of wheels on tracks. My body felt lighter, less substantial. The ghosts pressed closer, their cold embraces drawing out my warmth, my life, my very existence. I looked down at my hands and could see right through them. The train speaker system crackled to life, the announcement garbled and distorted. "Last stop. Last stop for the living. The voice was ancient, hungry, and somehow familiar, as if I'd been hearing it all my life, calling me down to these tunnels, waiting for me to finally answer. I fought it. God help me, I fought it with everything I had. I thought of Maria, of our children, of sunlight and fresh air, and everything that wasn't this nightmare train hurtling through the darkness. I slammed my flashlight into the window again and again, even as my hands grew more transparent. The ghosts tried to stop me, their touch burning with cold, their voices rising to a screaming chorus that threatened to shatter my mind. And then I heard it. Sarah's voice, distant but clear, singing her hymn. The same one she'd been singing when the train arrived. The ghosts recoiled from the sound, their forms growing dimmer. The hymn seemed to fill the car with light, pushing back the darkness, creating a space where reality still held sway. I don't remember breaking the window. I don't remember falling. I woke up on the platform at Chambers Street, my flashlight still clutched in my bloody hands. Sarah was kneeling beside me, still singing, tears running down her face. She helped me up, her hands warm and solid against my freezing skin. The train was gone. When I checked the security footage later, there was nothing but static between 2:17 a.m. and 3:45 a.m. Sarah gave her notice that same day. Before she left, she pressed her cross necklace into my hand. "Keep it," she said. "You might need it again." She never told me how she knew about the train, what she'd seen in her own late nights in the tunnels, but the look in her eyes told me enough. I quit the next week. The official report said I had a stress-induced breakdown, and maybe that's what they need to believe. But I know what I saw. I still have Sarah's cross, and sometimes, late at night, I can feel it growing cold, a warning that the train is running again. I still work nights, but above ground now. Sometimes I pass by subway entrances and hear that familiar rumble. Sometimes I see people rushing down the stairs late at night, hoping to catch one last train home. I want to stop them. I want to tell them what's waiting in those tunnels during the dead hour. But who would believe me? So I wrote this down instead. Maybe you'll believe me. Maybe you'll think twice before running to catch that last train. Because somewhere beneath the city, in tunnels that don't appear on any map, the ghost train is still running. And it's always looking for new passengers. Last week they showed another picture on the news. Lisa Chen disappeared from Chambers Street Station at 2:17 a.m. They found her purse on the platform and her phone. The last text she sent read, "Train's here early tonight." That's weird. I know where she is. She's riding the last train now, along with all the others. Sometimes I think I can hear their voices in the static of my radio, begging for help or warning others away. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror late at night, I see my hands starting to fade, just a little, and I wonder if part of me never made it off that train at all. But I can warn you, if you're ever in the subway late at night and you hear a train coming when there shouldn't be one, don't get on. No matter what you do, don't get on. Because the last train is always looking for new passengers, and it never, ever reaches its final destination. The quiet hum of the monitors was usually a soothing sound during my night shifts as a security guard at Horizon Imaging Labs. Like white noise, it had become a faithful companion through countless uneventful nights, blending with the soft whir of the air conditioning and the occasional click of the motion sensors. I'd taken the job because it was easy. Sit in a small room, watch a dozen screens, and occasionally do a round of the building. The pay was surprisingly good for such simple work, maybe too good looking back. Most nights, the only excitement came from small rodents triggering motion sensors in the parking lot, their tiny heat signatures dancing across the thermal cameras like fireflies in the dark. But that night was different. It started with a flicker. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Working the graveyard shift can do that to you. Make you see things that aren't there. Transform ordinary shadows into menacing shapes. The human mind, desperate for stimulation in the dead of night, has a way of manufacturing its own entertainment. But this was different. This was real. I leaned closer to the central monitor, frowning at the feed from Corridor C. A shadow darted across the frame, quick and fluid, like ink dropped in water. The movement was too precise, too intentional to be a glitch. Instinctively, I reached for the joystick to rewind the footage, my fingers finding the familiar rubber grip. The control room suddenly felt colder, though the temperature readout on the wall showed a steady 72 degrees. Replaying it frame by frame, I caught the movement again, a quick, blurry streak that seemed to defy the laws of physics. It wasn't large, more like the size of a cat, but something about its movement made my skin crawl. The weird part? The cameras in Corridor C were thermal, designed to pick up heat signatures, and this streak didn't register as warm or cold. It was as if something had torn a hole in reality itself, leaving a void where temperature should exist. I grabbed my flashlight, an industrial-grade maglite that had always felt reassuring in its weight and solidity, and headed for the corridor, partly out of duty, and partly to quell the creeping unease that had started to gnaw at me. I chalked it up to equipment failure, but my gut told me otherwise. Years of working security had taught me to trust that instinct, the primal part of our brain that remembers what it was like to be prey. The labs were eerily silent at night, the kind of silence that feels oppressive, almost physical in its weight. My footsteps echoed off the walls despite my attempt to walk quietly, each sound seeming to disturb something that preferred to remain undisturbed. The hallways stretched long and sterile, with their glossy tiles reflecting the faint glow of emergency lights like a mirror maze in some twisted carnival. The green exit signs cast sickly shadows that seemed to move when viewed from the corner of my eye. Corridor C was on the east wing, the oldest part of the facility, where they stored outdated imaging machines that no one had gotten around to decommissioning yet. The walls here bore the marks of age, hairline cracks in the paint, scuff marks from equipment being moved, and patches where different shades of white revealed years of touch-ups. As I approached, I heard it, a faint, intermittent buzzing that set my teeth on edge. It sounded like a fluorescent light on the fritz, but there was something else beneath that sound, something almost musical in its wrongness. When I scanned the corridor with my flashlight, all the bulbs were intact, their surfaces reflecting the beam back at me like dead eyes. The sound seemed to come from the far end, near the door to Lab 34. That was one of the labs slated for demolition next month, though looking at it now, I wondered if demolition would be enough to erase whatever presence had taken root here. I pushed open the door, wincing at the groan of old hinges that echoed through the empty corridor like a creature in pain. The lab smelled faintly of burnt plastic and disinfectant, with an underlying metallic tang that reminded me of blood. Machines the size of refrigerators loomed in the darkness, their surfaces dusty and covered with caution tape that fluttered slightly despite the lack of air movement. Warning labels and biohazard signs caught the beam of my flashlight, their red symbols seeming to pulse in the darkness. I swept the beam across the room, the shadows retreating like living things. Nothing. And yet, the buzzing grew louder, more insistent, like a hive of angry bees trapped in a jar. But these weren't bees. The sound had a mechanical quality that spoke of circuitry and electricity, rather than anything natural. I followed the noise to the center of the room, where one of the larger machines stood, the quantum resonance imaging spectrometer. Even covered in dust, it commanded attention, its sleek design suggesting something more advanced than the other abandoned equipment. I didn't know much about it, only that it had been a prototype for some groundbreaking tech that never made it past the testing phase. The researchers had been tight-lipped about its purpose, and rumors circulated about why it had been abandoned so suddenly. The screen on the machine flickered, casting weak light over the room in pulses that made the shadows dance. The machine wasn't even supposed to be powered. This wing's electricity was cut off after hours, the breakers physically locked in the off position. I'd checked them myself at the start of my shift, as I did every night. The display shouldn't have been possible. I stepped closer, my heart pounding now with such force I could feel it in my throat. The screen displayed a looping sequence of distorted static, but this wasn't the random noise of a broken monitor. Lines and shapes writhed in chaos, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly, like an M.C. Escher drawing come to life. The patterns seemed to move in impossible ways, suggesting depths and dimensions that shouldn't exist in a two-dimensional display. Then, out of the chaos, a single word materialized, each letter forming as if being written by an unseen hand. Leave. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the walls. The screen returned to static, the buzzing now deafening, taking on a quality that made my vision blur. I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted out of the lab, my boots squeaking on the polished floor, the sound somehow childish and terrifying at the same time. The darkness seemed to chase me, reaching for my heels with fingers of shadow. Back in the security room, I locked the door behind me and sank into my chair, the familiar creak of its springs offering little comfort. My hands were trembling as I grabbed the phone to call the supervisor. But as I lifted the receiver, I hesitated. What was I going to say? That a machine told me to leave? That I'd seen impossible shadows and patterns that defied reality? I'd sound insane. Besides, the job paid too well for me to risk getting fired over a weird malfunction. Rent was due next week, and my savings wouldn't cover it. I turned back to the monitors, seeking reassurance in their familiar glow. My pulse quickened. Corridor C was pitch black. All the lights were off, even the emergency ones that were on a separate circuit and battery backup. And yet the machine's room glowed faintly in the thermal feed, a soft phosphorescence that shouldn't have been possible. But that wasn't the worst part. The shadow was back. It moved unnaturally, sliding along the walls like liquid darkness given form and purpose. And this time, it wasn't alone. There were multiple shadows, writhing and shifting, as if they were crawling over each other in some obscene dance. They poured out of the lab like ink spilled in water, each movement suggesting an intelligence that made my blood run cold. The thermal camera showed no temperature variation, just void where heat or cold should be. I grabbed the radio, my fingers fumbling with the talk button. Dispatch, this is Charlie 5. I have a possible intruder in Corridor C, requesting backup. My voice sounded strange in my ears, too high and tight. Silence answered me, broken only by the soft static of an open channel. Dispatch, do you copy? Anyone there? The desperation in my voice was evident now. Still nothing. I checked the equipment. The signal was live, the green LED burning steadily. The malfunction must have been on their end. But something told me it wasn't a technical issue. Something was actively preventing communication. The shadows were moving toward the camera now, their movements becoming more coordinated, more purposeful. My chest tightened as they stopped just shy of the lens, writhing in place like tentacles made of pure darkness. One of them reared up, elongating into a form that almost resembled a person, if a person was made entirely of fragmented darkness and negative space. It tilted its head, as though looking directly at me through the camera, through space itself. The temperature in the room plummeted, my breath fogging in the air. Then the feed went black. I sat frozen for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the blood pounding in my ears, and the soft hum of equipment that now seemed more menacing than soothing. Then came the knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate rapping on the door to the security room, like someone testing the surface with their knuckles. The sound seemed to come from exactly eye level. "Who's there?" I called, my voice cracking. The words felt foolish as soon as they left my mouth. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to answer with a name and badge number. No response came, just the heavy silence of anticipation. The knocking came again, insistent this time, with a rhythm that was almost, but not quite familiar, like a half-remembered song, played slightly off-key. I reached for my flashlight and wrench, my only weapons against whatever waited in the darkness. The metal felt cold in my hands, almost painfully so. Slowly, I approached the door and peered through the peephole, my breath held tight in my lungs. No one was there. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, lit only by the dim emergency lights that cast more shadows than illumination. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement. A shape flitted past the hall's corner. Just a shadow, quick and soundless, but with that same liquid quality I'd seen before. I locked the door and backed away, putting as much distance between myself and whatever lurked outside as the small room would allow. The monitors flickered back on simultaneously, the sudden light making me jump. Every screen displayed the same image, the Chris machine glowing faintly in the dark lab. But there was something new. A figure stood in front of it, shrouded in the same liquid blackness I'd seen earlier. It was roughly human-shaped, but the proportions were wrong in ways I couldn't quite define. It raised a hand, or what I assumed was a hand, and pointed directly at the camera. Then, one by one, the monitors went black again, like eyes closing in sequence. I wasn't going to stick around to find out what happened next. I grabbed my keys and made a beeline for the exit, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. The hallways felt longer than usual, as if the building itself had grown, stretching like taffy in some nightmare dimension. My flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker with each step, despite the fresh batteries I'd installed at the start of my shift. The exit was just ahead, its illuminated sign a beacon of hope when the lights shut off completely. Every single light, including my flashlight, died simultaneously. Plunged into darkness, I panicked, running blindly until I crashed into the metal door. I fumbled with the keys, my shaking hands making it impossible to find the right one. Each key felt wrong in my fingers, as if they were changing shape as I touched them. Behind me, I heard the buzzing again. It was closer this time, almost melodic, like a warped song played through ancient speakers. My breath hitched as I felt a chill run down my neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched by something that existed just outside the boundaries of natural law. The air grew thick, making each breath a struggle. Finally, the key slid into place with a click that seemed too loud in the oppressive silence. I yanked the door open and bolted into the night, not stopping until I reached my car. The parking lot lights flickered as I passed beneath them, and I could swear I heard that buzzing following me, growing fainter with distance. As I peeled out of the parking lot, tires squealing on the asphalt, I risked one last glance at the building. The windows of Corridor C glowed faintly with that impossible light, and I could swear I saw a figure standing there, watching me leave. It raised its hand in what might have been a wave. The next day, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't explain what I'd seen, and I didn't want to try. Whatever that lab was working on, it had tapped into something beyond our comprehension, something that existed in the overlap between dimensions. The Chris wasn't just an imaging device. It was a window, or maybe a door. I've since heard rumors that Horizon Imaging Labs shut down a few months later, due to unexplained equipment malfunctions and multiple resignations. The building stands empty now, its windows dark, except on certain nights when people report seeing strange lights in the East Wing. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that buzzing in my dreams. It's accompanied by patterns that shouldn't exist, shadows that move with purpose, and that same sense of being watched by something that exists just outside our reality. And every time, I wake up with the feeling that something is standing just outside my bedroom door, its hand raised, waiting to knock. The worst part? Sometimes I think I hear it knocking, with that same almost familiar rhythm, like it's trying to remind me of something I've forgotten. Or maybe it's trying to teach me something new, Something about the places where reality wears thin, and what waits on the other side of that dimensional membrane. But I never answer. Some doors, once opened, can never truly be closed again. The whispers started on Sam's third night working security at the Fitzgerald building. At first, he tried convincing himself it was just the ventilation system on the third floor. But ventilation systems don't whisper your name. Sam. It floated through the darkness like cigarette smoke, barely there, but unmistakable. Sam gripped his flashlight tighter, its beam cutting through the darkness of the empty corridor. The digital display on his phone read 3:28 a.m., 5 minutes until his scheduled round of the third floor. The Fitzgerald building stood like a forgotten sentinel in downtown, its Art Deco facade a reminder of better days. Built in 1927 during the height of the city's industrial boom, it had survived economic crashes, urban renewal, and countless attempts at modernization. Its black marble columns and brass fixtures spoke of old money and older secrets, while intricate carvings of mythological creatures watched from above with hollow eyes. During daylight hours, lawyers and insurance agents filled its halls with purposeful steps and important conversations. But now, in the dead of night, the marble floors echoed with something else entirely. Sam hadn't always worked nights. 15 years of retail management at Mason's department store had burned him out on human interaction, making him crave solitude. The constant stream of demanding customers, endless holiday rushes, and mind-numbing corporate meetings had slowly chipped away at his soul until he barely recognized himself in the mirror. The final straw had been Black Friday last year, when a riot over discounted electronics had left 3 people hospitalized, and Sam questioning every life choice that had led him to that moment. When he'd seen the posting for night security at the Fitzgerald, it had seemed perfect. Decent pay, minimal interaction, just him and his thoughts. The job interview with Frank, the head of security, lasted all of 10 minutes in a cramped office that smelled of stale coffee and decades of cigarette smoke. Frank himself looked like he'd been part of the building since its construction, his face deeply lined and his gray hair thin and wispy. "Ever worked nights before?" Frank had asked, lighting a cigarette despite the yellowed "no smoking" sign directly above his desk. The smoke had drifted up toward the water-stained ceiling tiles, forming shapes that seemed to watch Sam with silent interest. "No, but I'm good with unusual hours," Sam had replied, trying not to stare at the strange shadows the smoke was casting. Frank had studied him for a long moment, smoke curling around his weathered face like a living thing. Something in his eyes had seemed almost pitying. "Third floor's yours, then. The previous guy quit without notice. These old buildings." He'd trailed off, stubbing out his cigarette in an overflowing ashtray shaped like a gargoyle. "Just don't spend too much time up there alone." Now, 3 weeks into the job, Sam understood why. The third floor was different from the rest of the building in ways he couldn't quite explain. The air felt thicker there, as if reality itself had congealed slightly. The shadows moved differently, lingering too long after his flashlight beam passed. And then, there were the whispers. 3:31 a.m. His footsteps echoed through the lobby as he approached the elevator, each step sending ripples through the pool of silence that filled the building. The brass doors, polished to a mirror shine during the day, looked dull and threatening in his flashlight beam, like the tarnished surface of an ancient coin. Sam usually took the stairs, better exercise, he'd told himself. But tonight, something about the stairwell felt wrong. The door to it stood slightly ajar, releasing a breath of stale, copper-scented air into the lobby. The elevator dinged softly, doors sliding open with a whisper of well-oiled metal. The interior was a perfect Art Deco time capsule, with dark wood paneling and an ornate brass ceiling that reflected Sam's face back at him in distorted fragments. He tried not to look up as he pressed the button for the third floor. The ride lasted exactly 27 seconds. Sam had counted them every night, a personal ritual that helped calm his nerves. He'd started doing it after noticing how the numbers on the floor indicator sometimes jumped erratically, showing impossible floors that shouldn't exist in an 8-story building. Tonight, though, the elevator stopped after just 23 seconds. The doors opened into darkness thicker than usual, as if the third floor existed in a deeper kind of night than the rest of the building. The smell hit him first, copper and decay, like pennies left too long in the rain. It had started appearing about a week ago, just a hint of something wrong in the air. Now it filled his nostrils, making his eyes water. The maintenance crew claimed they couldn't smell anything when he'd reported it, though Sam had noticed how none of them would meet his eyes. Their hands had trembled slightly as they signed off on his maintenance request, and they never came up to investigate. Sam's flashlight beam seemed dimmer here, barely penetrating the shadows that clung to the corners like living things. The temperature dropped with each step. He could see his breath forming clouds in the weak light. His watch read 3:33 a.m. He'd later realized this was impossible. It had been 3:31 when he entered the elevator, and the ride had taken 23 seconds. Time moved strangely on the third floor. The whispers started again, closer now, almost comprehensible. They reminded Sam of late-night radio stations picked up from far away, voices fading in and out of static, speaking words that almost made sense. He swung his flashlight toward the sound, but the beam caught only empty air and closed office doors. His footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound was being swallowed by something unseen. The third floor's layout had always bothered him. It didn't match the floors above or below it. The corridors bent at odd angles, and doors appeared in places that shouldn't be possible, given the building's exterior dimensions. Sam had tried mapping it once, but his drawings never came out right, the proportions shifting between one visit and the next. A door creaked somewhere ahead, the sound drawing out longer than it should have. Sam froze, listening. The night shift had taught him the building's language, the groan of settling walls, the hum of ancient pipes, the soft sigh of the ventilation system. This sound belonged to none of those categories. It was organic, almost hungry. "Hello?" His voice sounded small, swallowed by the darkness. "Building security. Anyone there?" The whispers answered, a chorus of voices just below the threshold of understanding. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, filling the corridor with their urgent murmuring. Some sounded familiar, like people he'd known but couldn't quite place. Others spoke in languages that had never existed on any human tongue. Sam's flashlight beam danced across the walls, catching something dark and wet spreading across the paint like ink through water. The stain moved against gravity, forming patterns that almost resembled faces. He'd seen similar marks before, though smaller, scattered throughout the third floor. They seemed to grow larger each night. The security cameras. Sam nearly laughed with relief, the sound sharp and brittle in the heavy air. Everything was recorded. If something was wrong, it would be caught on tape. He reached for his radio to call Frank in the monitoring room, trying to ignore how the plastic felt softer than usual, almost organic under his fingers. Static answered his call, broken by bursts of what sounded like breathing. Heavy, wet breathing, like something large struggling to draw air through fluid-filled lungs. "Frank, you there?" More static. Then, through the white noise, a voice. "You're not supposed to be here." The words came through crystal clear, despite the static. They weren't spoken into a radio. They came from directly behind him, close enough that he could feel cold breath on the back of his neck. Sam spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then something moved at the edge of the light, something low to the ground, crawling on all fours like a spider. The movement was wrong, each limb bending in ways that violated the basic principles of anatomy. His beam caught it fully, and Sam's breath froze in his lungs. The figure was humanoid, but wrong. Its limbs bent at impossible angles, its head twisted nearly upside down on a neck that was too long and segmented like an insect's. Its skin was the color of old paper, stretched tight over bones that seemed to shift and change with each movement, rearranging themselves beneath the surface like creatures trying to escape. But its face, God, its face. Where eyes should have been, there were only dark holes, endless and hungry, like windows into a void that existed before time began. Its mouth spread into a grin too wide for any human face, filled with row upon row of needle-sharp teeth that moved independently, each one seeming to watch him with malevolent intelligence. "Remember me?" it whispered, and its voice was familiar in a way that made Sam's blood run cold. It was the voice of David Cooper, the night guard who had worked here 6 months ago, the one who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a resignation letter written in handwriting that didn't quite match the samples in his personnel file. "You should. You took my place." Memories crashed through Sam's mind like shattered glass, fragments of another night, another time, the same corridor, the same whispers. A struggle in the darkness, cold hands around his throat, the taste of copper in his mouth, the elevator ride that had lasted 23 seconds instead of 27. The way his reflection had smiled at him when he wasn't smiling. "I was here before you," the thing said, crawling closer. Its movements were jerky, like stop-motion animation played at the wrong speed. "Just like you were here before him." It jerked its head toward the darkness behind Sam, the motion accompanied by the sound of cracking vertebrae. He turned slowly, knowing what he would see. Another figure emerged from the shadows, this one newer, its flesh not quite as decayed. Its security uniform, identical to Sam's, was still recognizable, despite the dark stains that covered it. The name tag read Michael, though the letters seemed to squirm and rearrange themselves when viewed directly. "The third floor needs its guardians," the first thing whispered, its voice now a chorus of all who had come before. "Always has. Always will. Since they laid the first stone. Since they made the first sacrifice. Since they spoke the words that should never have been spoken. The old contract must be honored." Sam tried to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The cold had seeped into his bones, turning his muscles to ice. The darkness around him felt alive now, pulsing with a horrible hunger that had existed since the building's foundations were laid. He watched, paralyzed, as both figures crawled toward him, their grins widening impossibly. "Welcome home," they whispered in unison, their voices joined by others from the darkness. Again. The last thing Sam saw was his own face, reflected in the brass elevator doors, twisted into the same hungry grin as the creatures approaching him. His features began to shift, rearranging themselves into something older, something that had waited in the darkness since the city was young. Then the darkness swallowed him whole, and Sam became part of the third floor's endless night. The next morning, Frank arrived to find Sam's flashlight lying in the third floor corridor, its beam still cutting weakly through the early morning shadows. Sam's car sat in the parking lot, his belongings untouched in the security office. The only evidence of his presence was a new dark stain on the wall, spreading slowly like spilled ink, forming patterns that almost looked like faces in certain lights. The security footage showed nothing unusual, just empty corridors and shifting shadows. No one noticed that the timestamp was frozen at 3:33 a.m., or that the camera occasionally caught glimpses of something crawling through the darkness, something that used to be Sam, something that still wore his face, though not quite in the right way. They hired a new guard the following week. The job posting mentioned nothing about the third floor, or the whispers that echoed through its halls at night. Nothing about the three shadows that now moved through the darkness, watching, waiting, hungry for company. Nothing about the way the elevator sometimes stopped after 23 seconds instead of 27, or how the shadows seemed to smile when no one was watching. But if you find yourself working nights at the Fitzgerald building, pay attention to the whispers. They might be trying to warn you, or they might be calling you home, adding your voice to the chorus that echoes through those haunted halls. And whatever you do, don't take the elevator to the third floor at 3:33 a.m. The Guardians are always looking for new recruits, always hungry for fresh voices to add to their endless conversation with the dark. Some say on quiet nights, when the moon is hidden and the city sleeps, you can hear them talking to each other, sharing secrets of the darkness, planning their welcome for whoever dares to take the night shift. Because on the third floor of the Fitzgerald building, every guard becomes a guardian, every watcher becomes the watched, and the darkness is always, always hungry for more. The whispers say there's still room for one more. Will you be next? The elevator doors are opening. The ride takes 23 seconds. Welcome home. The key appeared on my cleaning cart that Tuesday night, small and black and impossibly old. I'd been working the midnight shift at St. Mark's Hospital for 5 years, but I'd never seen anything like it. The metal was almost black with age, decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. Celtic knots that writhed and twisted in my peripheral vision. Ancient symbols that burned themselves into my retinas when I tried to focus on them. Somehow, I knew exactly what door it was meant for. The one at the end of the basement hallway that nobody talked about. The one that had haunted my dreams since my first shift. I should have thrown it away. Should have dropped it in the biohazard bin and forgotten about it. But I didn't. Instead, I slipped it into my pocket, feeling its unnatural warmth against my thigh through the fabric of my uniform. It pulsed there like a living thing, a heartbeat that gradually synchronized with my own until I couldn't tell them apart. Let me back up a bit. My name's Roy, and I've been the night janitor at St. Mark's since my wife passed. Cancer took her quick, 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral, and the midnight to 8 shift that nobody else wanted became my sanctuary. There's something peaceful about empty hospital corridors at 3 a.m., when the fluorescent lights buzz quietly and your footsteps echo off sterile tiles. Most nights, it's just me, my mop, and the occasional night nurse making rounds. The rhythm of work keeps the memories at bay, gives me something to focus on besides the empty side of the bed waiting for me at home. But the basement, that's different. St. Mark's basement is a maze of storage rooms and supply closets, added piecemeal over decades of expansion. The architects clearly never talk to each other. Corridors meet at impossible angles, and rooms appear where they shouldn't be able to fit. The old-timers say parts of it date back to the 1920s, when St. Mark's was more of an asylum than a hospital. Back when treatment meant something darker, when screams were muffled by thick walls and patient records disappeared with disturbing regularity. I'd found architectural plans in the hospital archives once, yellowed blueprints that made my head hurt to look at. The basement levels didn't match up with the floors above them. Spaces existed that couldn't possibly fit within the building's footprint. When I mentioned this to Marcus, the day shift supervisor who'd been here 30 years, he'd gone pale and told me to forget about it. You get used to it, my supervisor told me on my first day, not quite meeting my eyes. Just don't go poking around where you shouldn't. His hands had trembled as he handed me my keys, and I noticed he wore gloves despite the summer heat. Later, I learned why. He'd tried opening that door once, decades ago. The scars on his palms never quite healed. I knew exactly what he meant. There was one closet, tucked away where 2 hallways met at a sharp angle, that everyone avoided. The door was solid oak, darker and older than any other in the building, with a brass handle worn smooth by time. The wood seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a sort of void in the already dim corridor. I'd heard whispers about it, about the previous janitor who'd used it, about the things he'd collected, about the patients who'd gone missing. about the sounds that sometimes leaked out in the deepest part of night. But those were just stories, urban legends that every hospital accumulates like dust in its corners. At least that's what I told myself until I started hearing the music. It started 3 weeks ago. I was doing my usual rounds, thinking about what I'd make for breakfast when my shift ended, when I heard it. A crackling melody, drifting through the empty corridors. The sound was faint but clear, cutting through the usual basement ambiance like a knife. Old-fashioned brass and piano, the kind of tune you'd hear in a dance hall 90 years ago, complete with vinyl pops and scratches. Something about it made my skin crawl. The tempo was slightly wrong. The notes held a fraction too long, creating a dissonance that set my teeth on edge. It was coming from the closet. I remember standing there, mop frozen mid-stroke, listening to that impossible music. The door was locked, had been locked for decades according to Sarah, one of the night nurses who'd been here since the 80s. But the music was undeniable, floating through the air like smoke, wrapping around my thoughts until I couldn't focus on anything else. I swear I could smell cigarette smoke and perfume, hear the rustle of beaded dresses and the click of dancing shoes on hardwood floors. "You heard it too?" Sarah asked me a few nights later, her face going pale beneath her makeup. We were in the break room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Her hands shook as she lit a cigarette, despite the no smoking signs plastered on every wall. "The music?" I nodded, surprised by her reaction. "Yeah." Thought maybe it was an old radio or something. Even as I said it, I knew how ridiculous it sounded. What radio could play through solid oak, through walls thick enough to muffle screams? Sarah glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "That closet, it belonged to Sam Kelvin. I worked here in the 70s before my time. He had a collection." She took a long drag, the ember of her cigarette glowing like an evil eye in the dimness. "A collection?" "Personal items from patients. Things they left behind," he said. "Little treasures." She wrapped her arms around herself as if suddenly cold. The temperature in the break room had dropped noticeably, our breath forming little clouds in the air. No one thought much of it, until patients started disappearing. My coffee turned bitter in my mouth. Disappearing? They found things in that closet, photos that shouldn't exist, jewelry families swore had been buried with their loved ones, locks of hair tied with ribbons, labeled with names and dates. She shuddered. "They say Sam went mad, started taking things from patients, things they couldn't live without, vital things, essential things." "What happened to him?" "Vanished one night. They sealed up the closet after they found his collection, but they never found him." She met my eyes, and I saw real fear there. "Some say he never left, that he's still collecting, still hungry for those essential things that make us who we are." I tried to laugh it off, but the sound died in my throat, because by then, the music wasn't the only thing I'd been hearing, and Sarah knew it. I could see it in her eyes, in the way she wouldn't walk the basement corridors alone anymore. The scratching started a week after the music. Low at first, barely audible over the building's mechanical drone, but it grew louder each night. Desperate, frantic sounds, like someone clawing at the door from the inside. Sometimes, I thought I could hear whispers beneath the scratching, voices calling out in languages I couldn't understand. They spoke of loss and longing, of essential things stolen and locked away in darkness. And then the key appeared. I told myself I wouldn't use it, kept working my rounds, avoiding that corner of the basement where the corridors met at that wrong angle. But the music followed me, growing louder with each passing night. The scratching became more insistent, more desperate. And the voices. "Roy," they'd whisper, their words carried on the stale basement air. "Help us. Please help us." They knew my name, knew things about me they shouldn't, about Maria's last days, about the promises I'd made at her bedside, about the essential things I'd lost when she died. That's how I found myself standing in front of the closet at 3 a.m., the key burning in my hand like a hot coal. The music was louder than ever, the scratching almost frantic. My hands shook as I inserted the key into the lock, feeling it catch with a soft click that seemed to echo through the empty hallway. The metal was hot enough to blister, but I couldn't let go. Didn't want to let go. The mechanism moved smoothly, as if it had been recently oiled. The door swung open with a low creak, revealing darkness deeper than any basement shadow had a right to be. It was like looking into a void, a space where light and hope went to die. The smell hit me first, thick and rotten, like something decaying in stagnant water. But underneath that was something sweeter, something that made my stomach turn. It reminded me of the morgue, of things that should stay buried, of Maria's hospital room in those final days, when the smell of death had already begun to claim her. The closet was bigger than it should have been, much bigger. The space stretched back into impossible shadows, filled with shelves that seemed to go on forever. Each shelf was cluttered with objects, old, dusty things that looked like they'd been collecting for decades. Faded photographs in tarnished frames, small trinkets that caught what little light filtered in, bits of jewelry that gleamed dully, personal effects that seemed to pulse with a strange energy, each one containing something essential, stolen from its owner. But it was the walls that made my blood run cold. They were covered in scratches, floor to ceiling, like countless people had clawed at them in desperation. Some of the marks formed words, names, pleas for help that had gone unanswered. Dates going back decades, each one marking another addition to Sam's collection. I ran my fingers over them, feeling the grooves beneath my touch. The wall felt warm, almost feverish, like skin stretched over bone, like something alive. The photographs came next. They covered the back wall in a massive collage that stretched up into the darkness above. Each one showed a patient, their faces blank, their eyes hollow and staring. Some were smiling, others staring straight ahead with vacant expressions. I recognized some of them from old missing persons reports, patients who'd vanished over the years, their disappearances whispered about in break rooms and empty corridors. Each photo captured the moment their essential thing was taken, the instant they became part of the collection. In the center of it all was a photograph of a man in a janitor's uniform, his face twisted in a grotesque smile that didn't reach his eyes. The nameplate on his uniform read, S. Kelvin, in stark white letters. But it wasn't quite a photograph. The image moved slightly when I looked at it, the smile widening impossibly. Those dead eyes following my movements. The scratching grew louder, filling my head with its desperate rhythm. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows growing thicker, more substantial. The air became heavy, hard to breathe, tasting of dust and decay and lost things. The music warped, the notes twisting into sounds that hurt my ears. A carnival melody from hell. Help me. The whisper came from everywhere and nowhere, broken and desperate. More voices joined it, a chorus of pleas echoing through the impossible space. I recognized some of them, patients I'd cleaned up after, souls lost in the hospital's endless corridors. And underneath them all, impossibly, Maria's voice, calling my name. That's when I felt the hand on my shoulder. The fingers were long and thin, their grip ice-cold and impossibly strong. I turned, my heart threatening to burst from my chest, and found myself face to face with Sam Kelvin. He looked exactly like his photograph, yet somehow worse. A thing that had forgotten how to be human. His face was wrong, twisted and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. His eyes were empty sockets filled with writhing darkness, and his mouth was stretched into a smile that split his face almost in half. In his free hand, he held another key, identical to the one I'd found. Behind him, I could see shapes moving in the darkness. His collection, their essential things locked away in this impossible space. "You've come to take my place," he whispered, his voice like gravel in a meat grinder. "Someone has to keep the collection growing. Someone has to preserve the essential things." His grip tightened, and I felt something vital starting to slip away. Some core part of myself being drawn into his collection. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The darkness at the edges of my vision grew deeper, and I felt myself falling into those bottomless eyes. The last thing I saw was Sam's twisted smile, promising an eternity of collecting treasures in the dark, of preserving essential things that were never meant to be preserved. They found the closet open the next morning, the shelves covered in dust, the walls lined with fresh scratches. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and in the back, they found a new photograph pinned to the wall. My face, my eyes vacant, my expression frozen in a moment of terrible understanding. Another essential thing added to the collection. I was gone, my cart abandoned in the hallway, the key lying where I'd dropped it. The hospital hired a new night janitor the following week, and life went on as it always did at St. Mark's. No one asked too many questions. They never do in places like this, where the shadows run deep and some doors are better left locked. But every night, as the hospital falls silent and the shadows grow long, the scratching begins again, accompanied by the soft strains of an old dance hall tune. And sometimes, if you listen carefully, you can hear whispers in the dark corners of the basement. My voice among them now, calling out to whoever might find the next key, promising to share our collection of essential things. The closet remains open, its door never quite closing properly, as if something is preventing it from being sealed again. And the new janitor has already learned to avoid that corner of the basement, where two hallways meet at an impossible angle, and where the music never quite stops playing, where the collection grows ever larger, preserving things that were meant to be lost. For in that closet, in the depths of St. Mark's Hospital, Sam's collection grows ever larger. And we wait patiently for the next keeper of our treasures, our grotesque smiles widening in the dark as we add to our eternal collection, one soul at a time. One essential thing after another, preserved forever in our impossible space. They say if you visit St. Mark's Hospital late at night, when the corridors are empty and the shadows are long, you might hear old dance hall music drifting up from the basement. If you do, don't follow it. Don't look for the closet where two hallways meet at an impossible angle, and whatever you do, if you find a small black key that feels too warm to touch, throw it away. Run far and fast, and never look back. Because Sam's collection is always growing, and there's always room for one more treasure. Always space for one more essential thing, locked away in the dark where it can never fade or die. Where it remains preserved forever. In a closet that's bigger on the inside than any space has a right to be. And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, when the moon is hidden and the shadows are at their longest, you might hear us singing along to that twisted melody, our voices rising in an impossible harmony as we tend to our collection of essential things, forever growing, forever preserving, forever lost in the dark. The graveyard at night is not as eerie as people imagine, most of the time. The weathered headstones stand like silent sentinels beneath the shifting shadows of ancient oaks, their marble faces worn smooth by decades of wind and rain. The rustling leaves and distant traffic create a peaceful ambiance that feels more like a park than a place of eternal rest. I've been the groundskeeper at Oakwood Cemetery for almost 5 years, and for the most part, my night shifts are uneventful. The dead, after all, don't make much fuss. My job is to patrol the grounds, make sure no one's trespassing, and occasionally chase off the odd teenager trying to have a spooky dare night. I've grown accustomed to the quiet dignity of this place, to the way moonlight catches on polished granite and the soft whisper of wind through the cypress trees. But last week, something happened that I can't explain, and now I'm not sure if I'll ever look at this place the same way again. The memory of that night haunts me, turning familiar shadows into lurking specters and transforming every unexpected sound into a harbinger of the impossible. It was just after 11 p.m. when I started my usual patrol. A full moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the rows of headstones. Its pale light painted everything in shades of silver and deep blue, creating an otherworldly landscape of light and shadow. The graveyard stretched for nearly 50 acres, so I usually drove the golf cart around, stopping now and then to check for anything out of place. The electric hum of the cart's motor was my constant companion, a reminder of the modern world amid these ancient markers of mortality. As I rounded the farthest corner of the grounds, where the oldest graves lay, I heard it, a faint, tinny ringing. The sound seemed to pierce the night's stillness like a needle through fabric. I stopped the cart and turned off the engine, listening. The sound came again, faint but unmistakable, a phone ringing. In the sudden silence, the electronic tone felt jarringly out of place, an intrusion of the present into this sanctuary of the past. I frowned, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as I scanned the area. Cell phones weren't uncommon here. Visitors sometimes left them on graves as tributes or accidentally dropped them while paying their respects. The modern grieving process often includes these technological tokens of remembrance. But this wasn't coming from the surface. It sounded muffled, distant, like it was underground. The sound seemed to resonate with the earth itself, creating an unsettling harmony with the night's natural sounds. I followed the sound, my boots crunching on fallen leaves and loose gravel. The ringing grew louder as I approached a freshly dug grave, its dark mouth yawning open in the moonlight. The mound of dirt beside it was undisturbed, waiting for tomorrow's burial. Perfectly arranged tools lay nearby, ready for the morning's somber task. The phone was ringing from inside the grave, its electronic cry echoing off the earthen walls like a desperate plea. My first thought was that someone must have dropped it during the digging. That had to be it. But as I crouched by the grave, the sound became clearer, and a chill ran down my spine. This wasn't coming from the dirt pile. It was coming from the grave itself. The sound had a depth to it, a resonance that spoke of greater distances than just the few feet of freshly turned earth. I didn't want to overreact, so I grabbed the small spade I kept in the cart and started digging at the loose soil. My hands trembled slightly as I worked, though I told myself it was just from the night's chill. It didn't take long to hit something solid. Brushing away the dirt, I uncovered an old flip phone, scuffed and grimy but intact. The metal was corroded, the plastic casing yellowed with age. It shouldn't have worked. It looked like it had been buried for years, a relic of an earlier technological era. Yet, the screen glowed faintly, casting an eerie blue light on my hands. The phone continued to ring, its screen flickering like a guttering candle. The display looked ancient, the pixels degraded and dying, but still somehow functioning. The sight of it made my skin crawl, as though I was holding something that defied the natural order of things. I picked it up, hesitant, feeling its impossible weight in my palm. The number flashing on the screen was unlisted, just a series of zeros that seemed to pulse with an inner light. Against my better judgment, pushed by a curiosity I couldn't suppress, I flipped it open and pressed it to my ear. The plastic felt cold against my skin, unnaturally cold, like touching frozen metal. "Hello?" Static crackled on the line, faint and broken, like a radio signal from far away. The sound reminded me of old recordings of early radio transmissions, filled with the cosmic noise of vast distances. Then, through the static, a voice came, distorted but unmistakable. It seemed to echo from somewhere vast and empty, a space beyond normal understanding. "Help me?" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. "Who is this?" The static surged, the voice cutting in and out like a badly tuned radio. "I wasn't supposed to," The line went dead, with a finality that felt like a door slamming shut. I stared at the phone, my hands shaking uncontrollably now. It was absurd, impossible. The phone shouldn't have worked underground, shouldn't have worked at all, given its condition. And who could have been calling? The grave wasn't even filled yet, its emptiness a silent mockery of my rational explanations. I decided to take the phone back to the groundskeeper's shed and call the police. Maybe someone was pulling a prank, though I couldn't imagine how they could have orchestrated something like this. As I drove back, the cart's familiar electric hum doing little to calm my nerves, the phone buzzed in my pocket. This time, it wasn't a call. It was a voicemail notification, the alert tone muted and distorted as though coming from underwater. I stopped the cart and stared at the screen, its glow seeming brighter now against the darkness. One new message. The timestamp showed zeros where numbers should have been, as though the message existed outside of normal time. I shouldn't have listened. Every instinct told me to throw the phone away, to pretend I'd never found it. But curiosity got the better of me. That fundamental human need to know, to understand. I put the phone to my ear, my heart pounding so loud I could barely hear. The message was a jumbled mess of static and faint voices, overlapping like a crowd whispering at once. The sounds seemed to shift and change, sometimes seeming like words in a language I almost understood, other times like the meaningless noise of wind through dead leaves. It was hard to make out anything specific, but one phrase stood out, repeated over and over like a mantra. Find the truth. Back at the shed, I sat under the harsh fluorescent lights, trying to make sense of what had happened. The familiar space felt different now, the shadows in the corners deeper, more threatening. I replayed the voicemail over and over, hoping to hear something more, but it was the same every time. My thoughts turned to the grave itself, questions multiplying like shadows at sunset. Who was it for? What truth was I supposed to find? The answers seemed to hover just out of reach, like words on the tip of my tongue. I pulled up the burial schedule on the office computer, its screen casting a sickly glow across my desk. The grave belonged to a man named Harold Mercer, set to be buried tomorrow morning. The name wasn't familiar, but as I read through the file, my unease deepened, spreading through my chest like ice water. Harold Mercer was listed as an anonymous burial. No family, no visitors, just another unclaimed soul to be committed to the earth without ceremony. The records noted that his body had been found in an abandoned house on the edge of town, the circumstances of his death unclear. No autopsy report was attached, just a note that seemed deliberately vague. Body recovered intact, no immediate signs of trauma. The brevity of the report felt wrong, like crucial pages had been torn from a book. I leaned back in my chair, trying to shake the growing feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't uncommon for the cemetery to handle unclaimed bodies. Death doesn't discriminate between those with loving families and those without. But there was usually more paperwork, more details, more something. This file was sparse, like someone had deliberately left out details, reducing a human life to a few cryptic lines of text. I decided to check the grave again, but this time, I didn't get far. As I stepped outside, the night air thick with humidity, the phone buzzed again. Another voicemail. The notification seemed to pierce the darkness like a beacon, demanding attention. This time, the message was clearer, though still faint, as though spoken from a great distance. A single sentence played on a loop, each repetition more urgent than the last. They lied to you. My stomach churned, acid rising in my throat. Who had lied? About what? I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I'd found a buried phone that was leaving cryptic messages? That I was receiving calls from what seemed to be beyond the grave? I'd sound insane. The rational part of my mind struggled against the growing certainty that I was dealing with something beyond normal explanation. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back to the grave, its beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was trying to hold me back. The air felt heavier as I approached the site, like a storm was brewing. The grave looked the same as before, the mound of dirt undisturbed, waiting for its grim purpose. But as I shone my flashlight across the rows of headstones, I noticed something odd, something that made my blood run cold. One of the older headstones near the grave had been knocked over, its base cracked. The granite surface was covered in lichen, speaking to years of exposure to the elements. It had been intact earlier that night. I was certain of it. I crouched to examine it, and my breath caught in my throat, turning to ice. The name on the headstone was Harold Mercer. I stepped back, my heart racing like a trapped animal. The grave I'd just seen scheduled for burial tomorrow already had a headstone, and it was years old, weathered and worn by decades of sun and rain. The dates confirmed it. Harold Mercer had died in 1987. The implications were impossible, yet the evidence stood before me in carved granite. The buzzing started again. The phone, still in my pocket, vibrated insistently, like a living thing trying to escape. I pulled it out, my hands trembling violently now, and answered. The screen's glow seemed to pulse in rhythm with my racing heart. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking. "What do you want?" The voice on the other end was louder now, clearer, as though whatever barrier had separated us was breaking down. It was unmistakably the same voice from the first call, but now filled with a terrible urgency. "They buried me, alive." The line went dead with a finality that seemed to echo in my bones. I felt sick, my world tilting on its axis. Was this some kind of twisted joke? It couldn't be real. People didn't get buried alive anymore, not in modern cemeteries with their strict procedures and safeguards. But the voice sounded so certain, so desperate. The pain and fear in those words seemed to reach across decades, demanding recognition. I couldn't just leave it alone. The thought of walking away, of letting this mystery remain buried, was unbearable. I ran back to the shed, grabbed a crowbar, its weight reassuring in my hands, and returned to the grave. The dirt was loose, easy to shift aside, falling away like sand in an hourglass. Beneath the topsoil, I found the coffin, its edges scratched and scuffed, the wood warped with age. Deep gouges marked the lid, telling a story I didn't want to read. My gut churned as I pried it open, the hinges protesting with a sound like a distant scream. Inside, there was no body, just a set of bones, the skeleton curled unnaturally, as though clawing at the lid. The position spoke of desperation, of a final, futile struggle against the inevitable. But that wasn't what stopped me cold, what made my heart skip several beats. The skeleton was clutching a phone. I reported everything to the cemetery's management the next day, but they brushed it off as a prank, a story too impossible to acknowledge. The grave was refilled, and Harold Mercer's scheduled burial went ahead as planned, his body placed on top of the older coffin. The new earth covered both Harolds, the present layered upon the past, like sediment in an archaeological dig. But I can't stop thinking about what I saw, about the voice that reached across decades to tell its story, about the skeleton clutching the phone, its bony fingers forever frozen in a final attempt at connection. I don't know what truth I was supposed to find, what justice could be served after so many years. One thing is certain. The dead don't always rest in peace. Sometimes they reach out, trying to tell us their stories, hoping that someone will listen, someone will understand. And in the silence of the graveyard at night, when the moon is full and the shadows grow long, I wonder how many other untold stories lie buried beneath my feet, waiting for someone to answer their call. The courthouse after hours wasn't a place for the faint of heart. The massive stone building loomed against the night sky, its Gothic architecture casting twisted shadows across the empty parking lot. The weathered gargoyles perched on its corners seemed to watch my approach with hollow eyes. By day, the building was a bustling hub of attorneys, judges, and clerks. The marble floors echoed with purposeful footsteps, and the air hummed with the energy of justice being served. But at night, it transformed into something else entirely. A cavernous maze of silent hallways and echoing footsteps that seemed to follow you even when you were standing still. The fluorescent lights cast a sickly pallor over everything, making even familiar spaces feel alien and wrong. I didn't mind it much. As the night janitor, I was used to being alone. 7 years of working the graveyard shift had taught me to find comfort in solitude. I'd learned the building's rhythms, the gentle hum of the ancient heating system, the occasional creak of settling foundations, the way certain doors would stick in humid weather. But there was something about the 4th floor that always gave me the creeps. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up every time the elevator doors opened onto that particular landing. It was the oldest part of the building, untouched by renovations that had modernized the rest of the courthouse. While other floors boasted sleek LED lighting and modern furniture, the 4th floor remained frozen in time, like a museum exhibit nobody visited. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of dust and old wood, carrying undertones of mildew and something else, something that reminded me of old pennies and decay. The walls were lined with towering shelves, stuffed with records that no one had touched in decades. Their spines faded and cracked with age. Legal documents yellowed and brittle, filled with the forgotten stories of countless lives touched by the law. My boss called it the archives, but I called it the graveyard. It was where old cases went to die, and where I rarely lingered longer than necessary. That night, I didn't have a choice. The shift started like any other. I clocked in at 8 p.m., nodding to the evening security guard, Mike, as he finished his crossword puzzle. The lobby was already quiet, the last stragglers from the day shift having departed hours ago. I grabbed my cleaning supplies from the basement storage room, the familiar scent of industrial cleaners offering a small comfort against the growing darkness outside. The cart's squeaky wheel echoed through the empty halls as I made my way through the first 3 floors, emptying trash bins and vacuuming carpets. Each floor felt progressively emptier, progressively darker, as if the building itself was slowly falling asleep. By the time I reached the 4th floor, it was nearing midnight. The sound of the elevator doors sliding open into the pitch-black corridor made my stomach tighten, a Pavlovian response I'd never quite managed to shake. The doors closed behind me with a final sounding thud, leaving me alone in the darkness. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam seeming oddly dim in the thick darkness. The hallway stretched ahead of me like the throat of some ancient beast, lined with offices that hadn't been used in years. The carpet here was different, darker, older, with a pattern that seemed to shift and writhe in my peripheral vision. My job was to clean the few remaining workspaces that were still in use, mainly a couple of offices near the far end of the hall, where the most recent records were kept. The rest of the floor was supposed to be abandoned, left to gather dust and memories. Supposed to be. The first sign that something was off came as I passed one of the old conference rooms. Room 417. I remembered it from my first day, when my supervisor had warned me never to waste time cleaning the unused spaces. The door, which was usually locked tight, was slightly ajar. A faint line of light spilled out into the hallway, casting a long shadow across the floor that seemed to reach for my feet like grasping fingers. I frowned, my heart rate picking up slightly. No one was supposed to be up here. The cleaning schedule was designed specifically so I wouldn't encounter anyone else. It made the work more efficient, they said. But really, I think they just didn't want anyone else to have to deal with this floor. I nudged the door open with my mop handle and peeked inside, the old hinges creaking in protest. The room was empty, save for a single desk lamp glowing faintly in the corner. The bulb flickered erratically, like a dying firefly, casting strange shadows that danced across the walls. On the table beneath the lamp was a stack of yellowed case files, their edges curled with age, pages protruding at odd angles as if someone had been through them in a hurry. They hadn't been there the last time I cleaned this floor. I was certain of that. The room hadn't been touched in months, maybe even years. The layer of dust on every surface proved that, except for the circle of clean space around those files, as if someone had recently moved them there. I stepped closer, my flashlight beam illuminating the files. The beam seemed to waver, like it was struggling to penetrate some invisible barrier around the documents. The top file was labeled in bold, handwritten letters that looked almost fresh despite the aged paper. Case 1329A. Unsolved. The ink had a strange sheen to it, almost metallic, and I could have sworn it glistened wetly in the light. My curiosity got the better of me, despite every instinct screaming to leave well enough alone. I opened the file, the paper crackling beneath my fingers like autumn leaves. The first few pages detailed a criminal case from 1972 involving a high-profile bribery scandal. The defendant, a local businessman named James Morton, had mysteriously disappeared before the trial, leaving the case unresolved. But it was what came after that made my blood run cold. There was a list of names inside, judges, attorneys, even witnesses, all of whom had died under mysterious circumstances over the years following the trial. Judge Harrison Miller, found dead in his chambers, 1973. Cause, heart attack. Defense attorney Samuel Cooper, car accident, 1975. Vehicle never recovered. Key witness Maria Rodriguez, house fire, 1978. Body never identified. Court reporter Thomas Wells, suicide, 1980. Note mentioned shadows watching. The list went on, each death more suspicious than the last. But it was the final entry that made my hands shake. Security guard Michael Palmer, missing, 2023. Mike, our security guard, the one I'd seen just hours ago. The room suddenly felt colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly I could see my breath misting in the beam of the flashlight. I snapped the file shut, my heart pounding against my ribs like it was trying to escape. Something about the whole thing felt wrong. Not just suspicious or scary, but fundamentally wrong, like a violation of natural law. I decided to report it to my supervisor in the morning. For now, I just wanted to finish my shift and get out of there. As I moved farther down the hallway, the unease only grew. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing against my chest, making each breath a conscious effort. My footsteps seemed too loud, echoing off the walls and ceilings in a way that made it sound like someone was following me. The sound bounced back wrong, as if the acoustics of the space were being distorted by something I couldn't see. At one point, I turned sharply, convinced I'd heard the soft scuff of shoes behind me, the distinctive squeak of leather soles on old carpet. The beam of my flashlight swept over the empty hallway, the shadows seeming to retreat just ahead of its reach. Nothing. Just my own paranoia playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched remained, pressing against my back like a physical weight. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the mundane task of emptying trash bins and wiping down surfaces. But as I reached the end of the corridor, I noticed something strange. One of the office doors was open, wide open. Not just ajar like the conference room, but thrown open as if someone had left in a hurry. I knew for a fact it had been closed earlier. I always checked every door at the beginning of my shift, a habit born from years of late-night security concerns. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling slightly, sounding thin and weak in the heavy air. "Anyone here?" No response, just the subtle shifting of shadows at the edges of my vision. I stepped into the room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness like a knife. The office was bare, save for an old wooden desk and a filing cabinet in the corner. The drawers of the cabinet were open, files scattered across the floor as if someone or something had been searching frantically for something specific. The papers rustled softly in a breeze I couldn't feel. I bent down, picking up one of the files with trembling fingers. My blood ran cold as I read the label. Case 1329A. Evidence. The same case. The same impossible case that seemed to be haunting this floor. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered suddenly, buzzing faintly like angry insects before plunging the room into darkness. My flashlight faltered, the beam sputtering like a dying candle. Panic clawed at my chest as I fumbled with the switch, the darkness pressing in around me like a living thing. When the beam finally steadied, I froze. A shadow moved across the far wall. Not the natural shadow of furniture or something outside the window. This was different. This was a person. Tall, indistinct, and completely still. But wrong somehow, its proportions subtly off in ways that made my mind recoil. It stood where no one could possibly be standing, and it cast no shadow of its own. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking, barely recognizable as my own. The shadow didn't move. It didn't even flinch. It remained perfectly, impossibly still, like a photograph of something that should never have existed. I backed toward the door, keeping the flashlight trained on the wall. The shadow remained motionless, but the air in the room felt charged, like static electricity building before a lightning strike. The temperature continued to drop, until I could see frost forming on the nearby window. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead, as if the very air had become thick and resistant. Then the shadow shifted. It stretched unnaturally, growing taller and thinner, as if the wall itself were warping to accommodate it. The movement was smooth but wrong, like watching a film played backwards and slowed down. A low, guttural whisper filled the room, barely audible but unmistakable. It wasn't a voice. It was more like the sound of paper rustling, layered over and over until it formed words, like thousands of pages turning at once, whispering secrets that were never meant to be heard. They lied. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached the elevator, jamming the button repeatedly until the doors slid open. My fingers left frost on the metal surface. As the elevator descended, I could still hear the whisper, faint but persistent, echoing through the back of my mind. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, like it had taken up residence inside my skull. When the doors opened onto the ground floor, I expected relief. Instead, I found chaos. The lobby lights were flickering wildly, casting the room in a strobe-like glow that made everything seem to move in jerky, unnatural ways. Papers and files were strewn across the floor, as if a strong wind had torn through the space. But there was no wind, just that same heavy dead air from upstairs. The security desk was empty, Mike's chair overturned, his crossword puzzle abandoned mid-word. His coffee cup lay shattered on the floor, its contents frozen solid. I ran to the front door, only to find it locked. The electronic keypad that controlled the lock was dead, its screen flashing an error message in red letters that seemed to blur and shift as I watched. I banged on the glass, yelling for help, but the street outside was deserted. The few streetlights that usually illuminated the courthouse steps were dark, as if something had drawn all the light out of the world. A sound behind me made me turn. It was faint at first, like the rustle of fabric, but it grew louder, closer. Footsteps, but not normal footsteps. These sounded wet, like someone walking through puddles. But there was no water, just the sound, growing closer with each passing second. I turned slowly, my flashlight shaking in my grip. At the far end of the lobby stood the shadow, no longer confined to the walls. It loomed impossibly tall, its edges flickering like static on an old TV screen. The air around it seemed to ripple, distorting everything nearby like a heat mirage in winter. As I watched, frozen in terror, papers began to swirl around it, their edges blackening as if being burned by invisible flames. I stumbled backward, my mind racing for an escape. Then I remembered. The basement. There was an emergency exit down there, one that didn't rely on electronic locks. I sprinted for the stairwell, the shadow's presence pressing against my back like a physical weight, bringing with it the smell of old paper and copper pennies. The basement was a maze of storage rooms and maintenance corridors, lit only by ancient emergency lights that cast more shadows than illumination. My flashlight barely cut through the thick, oppressive darkness. I ran blindly, turning corners at random, desperate to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever was chasing me. The temperature continued to drop until my breath came out in thick white clouds, and frost crackled beneath my feet. Finally, I found it, the emergency exit. I slammed into the door, fumbling with the heavy latch, my fingers nearly frozen. It opened with a groan that sounded almost human, and I burst out into the cool night air, collapsing onto the pavement outside. The door slammed shut behind me, with a finality that seemed to echo through the empty street. The next morning I called my supervisor and quit. I didn't bother explaining why. I knew she wouldn't believe me. Who would believe a story about living shadows and frozen coffee cups? A week later, I heard that part of the fourth floor had been cordoned off due to unexplained structural issues. They never gave details, but I drove past the courthouse recently, late at night. The fourth floor windows were dark, except for one, a faint light flickering in what I knew to be room 417. I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else entirely. But one thing is certain. The courthouse holds secrets, and some of them don't want to stay buried. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whisper of turning pages in my dreams, and I wonder about Mike, about case 1329A, about all the other names on that list. And I wonder if somewhere, in some dusty file on that forgotten floor, my name has already been added to it. They say justice is blind, but what I saw that night makes me wonder. What if it isn't blind at all? What if it sees everything? And what if sometimes it decides to take matters into its own shadowy hands?